When a desperate father in 1882 Nevada decides to bury his paralyzed daughter alive, rather than watch her waste away, a mysterious widower arrives with a proposal that will change everything. But can one man's belief in her worth be enough to transform dust into stars? Or will the brutal frontier crush their fragile hope before it can take root? The shovel hit frozen ground with a dull thud that echoed across the empty Nevada desert. Ezekiel Ashworth wiped sweat from his forehead, even though the morning air was cold enough to see his breath. Behind him, inside the small wooden cabin, his daughter Cordelia lay in bed just like she had every day for 2 long years. "Papa's digging again," she whispered to herself, watching through the cracked window. The sound made her stomach twist into knots. She knew what that digging meant. Everyone in Silver Ridge knew what happened when fathers started digging holes near their cabins. Some holes were for water wells, some were for root cellars. But the hole Papa was digging was different. It was the right size and shape for something much worse. The year was 1882, and life in the Nevada Territory was harder than old leather boots. Silver Ridge had once been a booming mining town, with hundreds of people rushing around looking for precious metals. Now only about 20 families remained, scratching out a living from played-out mines and stubborn desert soil. Most folks had packed up their belongings and headed west to California, or north to Oregon, chasing rumors of better opportunities. Cordelia pressed her face against the cool glass and watched her father work. His beard had turned completely gray over the past 2 winters, and his shoulders curved forward like he was carrying an invisible heavy load. Before the fever had taken away the use of her legs, Papa used to smile and tell jokes. He would carry her on his back to the general store, where she would help him pick out supplies and talk to the other townspeople. Those happy days felt like they belonged to someone else's life. The fever had come during the terrible winter of 1880. It started as a simple cough, but within days Cordelia was burning hot and talking to people who weren't there. For 3 weeks, she lay unconscious while Papa sat beside her bed, holding her hand and praying to anyone who might be listening. When the fever finally broke, she was alive but different. Her legs wouldn't move, no matter how hard she tried. The doctor from Carson City had taken one look and shaken his head sadly. "Some things can't be fixed," he had said, collecting his fee and riding away. Since then, Papa had grown quieter and sadder with each passing season. The few remaining neighbors stopped visiting. The preacher rarely mentioned Cordelia in his Sunday prayers. Even Mrs. Henderson from the general store looked away when Papa came to buy supplies. Cordelia had become invisible, like a ghost haunting her own life. But being invisible meant she heard things people didn't think she could hear. She heard Papa talking to himself late at night, wondering how long his small savings would last. She heard him arguing with Mr. Peterson about borrowing money. Most frightening of all, she heard him talking to the preacher about doing right by the Lord and ending suffering before it gets worse. The digging stopped. Papa straightened up slowly, his back making small popping sounds like twigs breaking. He looked toward the cabin, and for a moment their eyes met through the window. Instead of waving like he used to do, Papa quickly looked away and picked up his shovel again. Cordelia's heart started beating so fast it made her chest hurt. She had been hoping she was wrong about the hole. Maybe Papa really was digging a new well or planning a root cellar for storing vegetables. But the way he couldn't look at her told a different story. The hole was exactly 6 feet long and getting deeper every day. Inside the cabin, everything reminded Cordelia of better times. The wooden table where she used to help Papa count coins from his mining work. The rocking chair where Mama used to sit and tell stories before she died, giving birth to Cordelia's little brother, who had lived only 3 days. The small shelf that held Cordelia's few books, gifts from Papa during happier Christmas mornings. Now the cabin felt like a trap. Cordelia could move around, using her arms to pull herself from the bed to the chair by the window. But that was the extent of her world. She couldn't gather firewood, couldn't help with cooking, couldn't contribute anything to their daily survival. In Papa's eyes, she had become nothing more than another mouth to feed, in a place where food was scarce and hope was even scarcer. The sound of approaching horses broke through her dark thoughts. Cordelia pulled herself up higher in bed to get a better view through the window. A single rider was coming down the dusty road that led to their cabin. The stranger sat tall in his saddle, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that hid his face in shadow. Papa heard the hoofbeats too. He dropped his shovel and reached for the rifle he always kept nearby. Visitors were rare in Silver Ridge, and unexpected visitors could mean trouble. Bandits sometimes traveled through, looking for easy targets. Claim jumpers might show up, hoping to steal whatever silver Papa had managed to pull from his exhausted mine. But this rider moved slowly and kept his hands visible on the reins. He wasn't trying to sneak up or surprise anyone. When he got close enough, he called out in a strong, clear voice that carried across the morning air. "Good morning. Name's Nathaniel Blackwood. I'm looking for honest work and heard there might be opportunities in Silver Ridge." Papa didn't lower his rifle, but he didn't point it directly at the stranger either. Most opportunities in Silver Ridge died out with the silver strike. Unless you're planning to move on, there ain't much here for a working man. The rider came to a stop about 20 feet from the cabin and slowly dismounted. Now Cordelia could see him more clearly. Nathaniel Blackwood was tall and lean, with dark hair showing gray at the temples. His clothes were dusty from travel but well made, suggesting he wasn't just another drifter with empty pockets. Something about the way he moved reminded Cordelia of a cat, careful and alert, but not afraid. "I'm not looking to get rich," Nathaniel said, his hands staying away from the gun at his hip. "Just looking for a place to be useful. I've got experience with mining, farming, building, and most anything else that needs doing." Papa studied the stranger for a long moment. Cordelia held her breath, wondering what would happen next. She had a strange feeling that this man's arrival was going to change everything, though she couldn't say whether that change would be good or bad. The coffee was weak, but Nathaniel Blackwood didn't complain as he sat on the wooden porch with Papa. Cordelia could hear every word through the thin cabin walls, and she listened carefully while pretending to read one of her books. Something about this stranger made her curious in a way she hadn't felt for a long time. "Where are you traveling from?" Papa asked, still holding his rifle across his knees, even though Nathaniel had shown no signs of being dangerous. "Most recently from Sacramento," Nathaniel replied. "Before that, a dozen different towns across California and Nevada. I've been moving around quite a bit since my wife died last spring." Papa's grip on the rifle relaxed slightly. Shared grief had a way of building bridges between strangers, especially on the frontier, where death was always close by. "Sorry for your loss. Losing a spouse ain't easy." "Eleanor was everything good in my world," Nathaniel said quietly. "We had 7 years together, which was more happiness than some folks get in a lifetime. But when the consumption took her, I found I couldn't stay in the places we'd been happy together. Too many memories in every corner." Cordelia felt a sharp pain in her chest that had nothing to do with her physical condition. She understood about memories hiding in familiar places. Sometimes she avoided looking at certain parts of the cabin because they reminded her too strongly of who she used to be when her legs worked and her future seemed bright with possibilities. "So you've been drifting ever since?" Papa's voice had grown gentler. "Not drifting exactly, more like searching." Nathaniel took a sip of the weak coffee and gazed out at the desert landscape. "I've been looking for a place where I could be useful again, where my hands could build something, instead of just working for wages that disappear as fast as I earn them." Papa was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made Cordelia's blood turn cold. "Well, Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate you stopping by, but I'm afraid Silver Ridge ain't the place you're looking for. In fact, I'm planning to leave myself real soon. Got some family business to take care of first, but after that..." He trailed off, but Cordelia knew what he meant. "What kind of family business?" Nathaniel asked. Papa's boots scraped against the wooden porch as he shifted uncomfortably. "Got a daughter inside. She's been suffering for a couple years now. Can't walk, can't work, can't contribute nothing to keeping us alive. I've been thinking it might be kinder to let her join her mama in heaven, rather than watch her waste away while I fail to provide proper care." The words hit Cordelia like a physical blow. Hearing Papa talk about her death so casually, like discussing the weather or the price of supplies, made her feel smaller than dust. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to prove she was still alive and valuable. Instead, she lay frozen in her bed, listening to her father plan her burial with a complete stranger. But Nathaniel's response surprised everyone. "May I ask what happened to her?" "Fever took the use of her legs 2 winters back. She's been bedridden ever since, and I can't afford to keep feeding 2 people on what little I can pull from a played-out mine." "And she's in pain?" Papa hesitated. "Well, no. She don't complain about hurting, but she can't do nothing for herself. And can she think clearly? Can she talk and understand what's happening around her?" "Course she can. Cordelia's smart as a whip. Always has been. But being smart don't put food on the table or firewood in the stove." Nathaniel was quiet for such a long time that Cordelia wondered if he had fallen asleep. Finally, he spoke again, and his words changed the direction of everything. "Mr. Ashworth, I wonder if I might make you a proposition." "What kind of proposition?" "The kind that might solve both our problems. You need help supporting your daughter, and I need a place where I can be useful instead of just wandering around feeling sorry for myself. What if I stayed here and helped you work the mine and maintain the homestead? In exchange, I'd ask for nothing more than meals and a place to sleep." Papa sputtered like water hitting a hot pan. That's mighty generous, Mr. Blackwood, but I couldn't ask you to take on that kind of burden. Cordelia needs a lot of care, and there ain't much hope of the situation improving." "Who says she's a burden?" Nathaniel's voice had an edge to it now. "Seems to me you've got a daughter who's survived a fever that kills most people, who's kept her mind sharp even when her body failed her, and who's been listening to every word we've said through that window behind you." Cordelia gasped and pulled back from the window, her heart hammering. How had he known she was listening? "The curtain moved 3 times while we've been talking," Nathaniel continued, "and I can see her shadow on the wall. Takes intelligence and curiosity to eavesdrop that effectively." Despite her fear, Cordelia felt a tiny spark of pride. No one had called her intelligent for a very long time. Papa turned to look at the window, and Cordelia quickly pretended to be reading. When he turned back to Nathaniel, his voice was defensive. "She's a good girl, always has been. But good don't change the fact that she can't contribute nothing to our survival. Can she read? Better than most adults. Can she write? Beautiful handwriting. Taught her myself. Can she do arithmetic? Keep books better than the bank clerk in Carson City. Can she cook?" Papa hesitated. "Well, she used to help her mama before the fever, but she can't stand at the stove now. Can she sew? Made most of her own clothes before she got sick." Nathaniel stood up, and Cordelia heard his boots cross the porch. "Mr. Ashworth, you've just described someone who could keep records for a mining operation, teach children to read and write, prepare medicines from desert plants, repair clothing and equipment, and contribute in dozens of ways that don't require walking around. The only burden I see here is the weight you've been carrying by trying to do everything alone." Papa's voice cracked when he spoke. "But she can't. She can't be a proper wife to anyone or have children of her own. What kind of future is that?" "The kind of future she gets to choose for herself," Nathaniel replied firmly, "instead of having it chosen for her by folks who think they know what her life is worth." A long silence fell over the porch. Cordelia realized she had been holding her breath and slowly let it out. For the first time in 2 years, someone was talking about her future as if it might contain something other than death and disappointment. "I don't understand why you'd want to take this on," Papa said finally. "You don't owe us nothing." "Maybe not, but I owe it to my Eleanor's memory to help where I can. And I owe it to myself to find a place where I can build something meaningful instead of just drifting from town to town, carrying grief like a millstone around my neck." Papa's chair creaked as he stood up. I need to think about this. Of course. It's a big decision. But while you're thinking, maybe you could introduce me to your daughter. Seems like she ought to have a say in what happens to her own life. Cordelia's heart jumped into her throat. She wasn't ready to meet this stranger who had suddenly appeared to disrupt Papa's plans. She wasn't ready to hope that her life might be worth saving after all. But ready or not, she could hear Papa's footsteps approaching the cabin door. A horse's hooves pounded against the hard earth like a drumbeat of change. Cordelia pressed her face to the window glass, watching a tall stranger ride into their yard, just as her father stepped outside with his rifle. The timing felt like more than chance. It felt like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared speak. The rider dismounted with slow, careful movements. His black coat hung loose on his frame, and dust covered him from head to toe like he'd been traveling for weeks. When he removed his hat, Cordelia saw streaks of gray in his dark hair, though his face didn't look old enough to match. "Morning?" the stranger called out, his voice carrying a roughness that spoke of too many nights sleeping under stars. "Name's Nathaniel Blackwood. I'm looking for any kind of work you might have." Ezekiel kept his rifle ready but didn't point it. "Work's scarce around here, mister. Most folks have packed up and moved on to greener places." Cordelia held her breath. Something about this man felt different from the usual drifters who passed through Silver Ridge. He stood straighter despite his obvious weariness, and his eyes held a sadness that reminded her of her own reflection in still water. "I've got strong hands and I'm not picky about the work," Nathaniel said, glancing toward the cabin's broken fence and sagging roof. "Looks like this place could use some fixing up." "We don't have money to pay hired help," Ezekiel replied, but his voice had softened slightly. "Maybe we could work out a trade. I need a place to rest my horse and myself for a spell, and you need repairs done." Nathaniel gestured toward the corral, where the gate hung crooked on its hinges. "I'm good with wood and tools." Through the window, Cordelia watched her father consider the offer. She could see the war playing out on his weathered face, pride fighting against practical need. The cabin did need repairs they couldn't afford, and winter would come again, whether they were ready or not. "What brings you to Silver Ridge?" Ezekiel asked, still not lowering his rifle completely. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the mountains in the distance. "Lost my wife to consumption last spring. Been wandering since then, looking for a place where the memories don't follow so close behind." The words hung in the air like morning mist. Cordelia felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of grief that matched her own. She had lost her legs, and he had lost his wife. Both of them knew what it meant to have pieces of themselves torn away. "I'm sorry for your loss," Ezekiel said, finally lowering his rifle. "Thank you kindly." Nathaniel replaced his hat, tilting it against the morning sun. "Eleanor always said that sorrow shared is sorrow halved. Don't know if that's true, but I reckon it can't hurt to find out." Cordelia pressed closer to the window, straining to hear every word. There was something in the stranger's voice when he spoke his wife's name, a tenderness that made her think of how her mother used to hum while braiding her hair. "You mentioned the Lord's care earlier," Nathaniel continued, his tone careful but curious. "Sounds like you've got troubles of your own." Ezekiel's shoulders sagged as if a great weight had settled on them. He glanced toward the cabin, and Cordelia quickly pulled back from the window, not wanting to be seen listening. "My daughter's been unwell. Can't use her legs since the fever took her 2 years back." The words came out rough and broken. "I've been trying to do right by her, but a man can only carry so much before he breaks." "Breaking's not the same as failing," Nathaniel said quietly. "Sometimes things break so they can be put back together stronger." Cordelia's heart hammered against her ribs. No one had ever talked about her condition like that before, as something that might be fixed rather than endured or buried. "Would you like some coffee?" Ezekiel asked, surprising them both. "Least I can offer after you've come so far." "That's mighty generous of you." As the two men walked toward the cabin, Cordelia quickly arranged herself in bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. She closed her eyes and tried to slow her breathing, not wanting them to know she had been listening to every word. The cabin door creaked open, and she heard her father's heavy boots cross the floor. "Cordelia," he said softly, "we've got a visitor." She opened her eyes and turned her head, meeting the gaze of the stranger Nathaniel, who stood in the doorway holding his hat. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and when he looked at her, she didn't see pity or disgust. She saw something else entirely: interest, maybe even respect. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, miss," Nathaniel said, inclining his head slightly. "Cordelia," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's a beautiful name. Means daughter of the sea, if I remember my Latin correctly." Nobody had ever told her what her name meant before. The knowledge felt like a small gift, something precious to hold on to. "You know Latin?" Ezekiel asked, clearly surprised. "My Eleanor was a teacher before we married. She taught me to read and write proper, and a few other things besides." Nathaniel's smile was sad, but genuine. "Always said learning was like collecting treasures that nobody could ever steal from you." Cordelia felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. It had been so long since anyone had talked about learning as something wonderful instead of wasteful. Her father had taught her to read, but he'd always made it clear that book learning was less important than practical skills she could no longer perform. "Cordelia's always been clever with books," Ezekiel said, though he sounded almost apologetic about it. "Intelligence is a rare and valuable thing," Nathaniel replied, his eyes still focused on her, "especially in a place like this, where most folks are too busy surviving to think much about living." The distinction hit Cordelia like lightning. Surviving versus living, she had never thought about it that way before. For the past 2 years, she had definitely been surviving. But living? That seemed like something other people did. People who could walk and work and make their own choices. "Mr. Blackwood here is looking for work," Ezekiel explained, as he poured coffee from the pot that always sat on the stove. "Thinks he might help us fix up the place in exchange for board." "That sounds fair," Cordelia said, then immediately worried she had spoken out of turn. Her father usually made decisions without asking her opinion, but Ezekiel didn't scold her. Instead, he looked thoughtful. "Reckon it might work out for everyone." Nathaniel accepted the coffee cup with both hands, wrapping his fingers around it like he was trying to capture its warmth. "I'm grateful for the opportunity. Been too long since I had a purpose beyond just moving from one day to the next." As the three of them sat in the small cabin, Ezekiel and Nathaniel, on wooden chairs, Cordelia propped up in her bed, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping kind that left her disappointed, but something steadier and more substantial. Maybe this stranger's arrival really was an answer to prayer. Maybe there were still surprises left in her small, circumscribed world. And maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over yet. The morning sun slanted through the cabin windows 3 days later, illuminating Nathaniel's careful hands as he whittled a piece of pine wood. Cordelia watched from her bed, fascinated by the way shavings curled away from his knife to reveal the shape hidden inside the rough timber. "What are you making?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "A bird," he replied, without looking up. "Eleanor used to say that every piece of wood has something beautiful trapped inside it, just waiting for the right person to set it free." Cordelia studied the emerging form in his hands. She could see wings beginning to take shape, delicate and precise. "Your wife sounds like she was very wise." "She was. Wiser than me, that's for certain." Nathaniel's knife paused for a moment. "She would have liked you, I think. Would have appreciated your quick mind and gentle spirit." Nobody had ever called her spirit gentle before. Her father usually described her as stubborn or willful when she asked too many questions or wanted to do things beyond her reach. "I wish I could have met her," Cordelia said honestly. "Me too." Nathaniel resumed his carving, his movements steady and sure. She had a way of seeing possibilities where other folks saw only problems. "Kind of like what I see when I look at you." Cordelia felt heat rise in her cheeks. "What do you mean?" "Well, your father's been telling me about all the things you can't do because of your legs." But I've been watching you these past few days, and I keep noticing all the things you can do." He gestured toward the neat stack of mended clothes beside her bed. "You've got the finest stitching I've ever seen. And yesterday, when that peddler came by, you calculated his change faster than he could count his coins." "That's just arithmetic," Cordelia protested, though secretly she was pleased he had noticed. "Maybe to you, but I've known grown men who couldn't add two numbers together if their lives depended on it." Nathaniel held up the partially carved bird, examining it from different angles. "Your mind works like this knife. It finds the true shape of things by cutting away what doesn't belong." Before Cordelia could respond, the cabin door opened and Ezekiel entered, carrying a bucket of water from the well. His face was flushed from exertion, and sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. "Morning," he said, setting the bucket down heavily. "How are you folks getting along?" "Mr. Blackwood was showing me his carving," Cordelia replied, "and telling me about his wife." Ezekiel's expression tightened slightly. "I see." Nathaniel seemed to sense the shift in mood. He set down his carving and knife, giving his full attention to Cordelia's father. "Mr. Ashworth, I hope you don't mind me spending time talking with your daughter. She's got a remarkable mind, and it's been a pleasure getting to know her." That's kind of you to say." Ezekiel sank into his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. "But talking won't change her situation, won't make her walk again, or find her a husband, or give her the life she was supposed to have." The words hit Cordelia like physical blows. She had heard variations of this speech many times before, but it hurt no less for being familiar. "Respectfully, sir, I disagree," Nathaniel said quietly. "Seems to me she's got exactly the life she's supposed to have. It's just different from what you expected." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. Easy words from a man who doesn't have to watch his child waste away in a bed, knowing he can't provide for her proper. "You're right. I don't know what that's like." Nathaniel's voice remained calm, but Cordelia could hear steel underneath. "But I do know what it's like to love someone and feel helpless to protect them from suffering. And I know what it's like to make decisions based on fear instead of hope." "Fear?" Ezekiel's voice rose. "You think I'm acting out of fear?" "I think you're acting out of love," Nathaniel corrected gently. "But love twisted up with fear can make us do things we never thought we'd do, make us give up on people we die to protect." Cordelia held her breath, watching the two men face each other across the small cabin. She could feel the tension stretching tight between them, like a rope about to snap. "What would you have me do?" Ezekiel demanded. "Keep her here until we both starve? Watch her grow old alone while other young women marry and have families? I'd have you ask her what she wants," Nathaniel replied simply. Both men turned to look at Cordelia, and she felt the weight of their attention like sunlight through a magnifying glass. Her father's face was a mixture of pain and frustration, while Nathaniel's held patient expectation. She began, then stopped. What did she want? For 2 years, she had been so focused on surviving each day that she hadn't dared to think beyond it. "Take your time," Nathaniel said softly. "It's an important question." Cordelia closed her eyes and tried to imagine different futures. She could picture herself in a pine box, buried in the little cemetery outside town, her father standing over the grave with relief and sorrow warring in his heart. She could see herself growing old in this bed, watching through the window as life passed her by. But she could also imagine other possibilities, ones she had never allowed herself to consider before. She could see herself teaching children to read the way Nathaniel's wife had done. She could picture her hands creating beautiful things, whether with needle and thread or with the carving knife Nathaniel had been showing her how to use. "I want to live," she said finally, opening her eyes to meet her father's gaze. "Not just survive, but really live. I want to learn things and make things and help people if I can. I want to matter." Ezekiel's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like he might cry. "Baby girl, you already matter. You've always mattered. Then why were you going to bury me?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Ezekiel opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to find words that could bridge the gap between his love for her and his fear of failing her. Because, Nathaniel said quietly, sometimes the people we love most are the ones we're most afraid of disappointing, and sometimes that fear makes us do terrible things, thinking we're being merciful. Ezekiel's shoulders shook, and Cordelia realized her strong, stubborn father was crying silent tears that carved tracks through the dust on his weathered cheeks. "I don't know how to take care of you proper," he whispered. "I don't know how to give you the life you deserve." "Maybe that's not your job," Cordelia said gently. "Maybe your job is just to love me and let me figure out the rest." Nathaniel picked up his carving again, his knife working to free the bird's tail feathers from the wood. "In my experience, the best things in life come from people working together, not from one person trying to carry all the weight alone." He looked up at both of them, his storm cloud eyes serious and kind. "What if we all stayed together? What if we built something here that none of us could manage on our own?" Cordelia felt her heart leap like a sparrow taking flight. The possibility he was suggesting seemed too good to be real, too bright to look at directly. But maybe, just maybe, it was exactly what they all needed to transform their dust into stars. A gunshot cracked across the desert like breaking bone. 3 weeks had passed since Nathaniel arrived, and now dust clouds on the horizon meant trouble was riding toward Silver Ridge with the setting sun. Cordelia pressed her face against the cool window glass, watching her father grab his old rifle from above the door. His hands shook as he checked the bullets inside. She had never seen him this scared before, not even when the claim jumpers came last winter. "Who is it, Papa?" she called out. But Ezekiel was already stepping onto the porch where Nathaniel stood waiting. The riders came closer, and Cordelia could see there were 4 of them. The man in front sat tall on a black horse, his silver belt buckle catching the last rays of sunlight. Even from her bed, she could feel the danger rolling off him like heat from a forge. "Ezekiel Ashworth!" The man's voice boomed across the yard like thunder before a storm. "Heard you got yourself some new help around here." Nathaniel moved down the porch steps, his boots making soft sounds in the dirt. His hand hung loose by his side, but Cordelia noticed how his fingers curved slightly, ready to grab the gun on his hip. She had watched him practice his draw behind the barn when he thought no one was looking. "Evening, Mr. Grimwald," Nathaniel said, his voice calm as still water. "Beautiful night for a ride." Silas Grimwald climbed down from his horse, his spurs jingling with each step. The 3 men behind him stayed mounted, their faces hidden in shadow under their hat brims. One of them kept spitting into the dirt, making dark spots in the dust. "Don't play games with me, stranger," Grimwald snarled, showing teeth that looked like broken fence posts. "I know all about you filling that crippled girl's head with fancy ideas, making her think she's worth something, when everyone knows she ain't." Cordelia's cheeks burned hot with shame and anger. She had heard these words before from other people in town, but hearing them said so cruel and loud made her stomach twist like a wrung-out wash rag. Nathaniel took another step forward. "I think you better watch your tongue when you talk about Miss Ashworth." "Miss Ashworth?" Grimwald laughed, a sound like rocks falling down a cliff. "That's rich. The girl should have been planted in the ground months ago, saving everyone the trouble of pretending she matters." Behind the window, Cordelia bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. For weeks, Nathaniel had been teaching her things that made her feel useful again. How to mix medicine from desert plants. How to keep careful records of money and supplies. How to mend tears in cloth so neat you could barely see the fix. All of it felt so fragile now, like soap bubbles that one harsh word could pop forever. Ezekiel stepped forward, his rifle pointed at the ground but ready. "Silas, you've said your piece. Now I think it's time you rode on." "Oh, I'll ride on," Grimwald said, his hand moving to rest on his gun handle. "But first, I'm going to make sure this family understands their place in the natural order of things. Some people are meant to live, and some people are just taking up space that others could use better." The wind picked up, stirring the dust around their feet and making the porch boards creak. Cordelia could smell rain coming from somewhere far off, mixed with the sharp scent of sage and the metallic tang of fear. "The only person taking up space here," Nathaniel said, his voice getting lower and more dangerous, "is you." One of the mounted men shifted in his saddle, and Cordelia saw the flash of metal as he loosened his gun in its holster. Her heart started beating so fast, it felt like a bird trapped in her chest. "You got a lot of mouth for a drifter with no claim to anything here," Grimwald said. He took another step closer to Nathaniel. "This girl's daddy was about to do the right thing before you showed up with your bleeding heart nonsense." "Papa?" Cordelia whispered, but her voice was too quiet to carry through the glass. "I was wrong about a lot of things back then," Ezekiel said, his voice stronger now, "but I'm not wrong about this. Nobody's got the right to decide my daughter ain't worth keeping around." Grimwald's face twisted into an ugly grin. "Your daughter? She can't walk, can't work, can't bear children? What good is she to anybody? She's just a mouth to feed and a burden to carry until the day she dies." The words hit Cordelia like physical blows, each one making her smaller and more worthless. She closed her eyes tight and tried to remember what Nathaniel had told her just that morning while she helped him inventory their small supply of medicine bottles. "Worth ain't about what you can do with your legs," he had said. "Worth is about what you do with your heart and your mind and your hands." When she opened her eyes again, Nathaniel was standing directly in front of Grimwald, so close she could see the muscles in his jaw working, like he was chewing on words too dangerous to speak out loud. "Mister," Nathaniel said, his voice quiet as smoke, "I've buried one good woman already. I'll be damned if I'm gonna stand by and watch ignorant men try to bury another one while she's still breathing." The first shot came faster than lightning, splitting the sky. Grimwald's hand swept toward his gun, but Nathaniel was already moving. Cordelia watched through the window as both men drew their weapons in one smooth motion, like dancers who had practiced the same deadly steps 1,000 times before. The boom of gunfire filled the air, and Cordelia saw Nathaniel stumble backward, red spreading across his left shoulder like spilled paint. But Grimwald was clutching his right hand, his gun lying in the dirt where he had dropped it. "Kill him!" Grimwald shouted to his men. But they were having problems of their own. Ezekiel had dropped behind the wooden porch railing and was firing his rifle at the mounted men. His first shot took the hat clean off one rider's head. The second shot made another man's horse rear up and dance sideways, nearly throwing its rider into the dirt. Cordelia pressed herself against the window, her heart hammering like a woodpecker on a hollow tree. She had never seen real violence before. Not like this. The sound of the guns was so much louder than she had imagined, and the smell of gunpowder was already drifting through the cracks around the window frame. Nathaniel rolled behind the water trough, blood running down his arm but his gun still steady in his right hand. One of Grimwald's men had dismounted and was trying to circle around behind the cabin. Cordelia could see him creeping through the shadows, getting closer to where her father was hidden. "Papa!" she screamed, pounding on the window glass with her fists. "Behind you!" Ezekiel spun around just as the man raised his gun. The two shots came so close together they sounded like one, and for a terrible moment, Cordelia couldn't tell who had been hit. Then the stranger fell forward into the dirt, and her father was still standing. But the fight wasn't over. Grimwald had picked up his gun with his left hand, and he was advancing on Nathaniel's hiding spot behind the water trough. His face was twisted with rage and pain, and Cordelia could see he meant to finish what he had started. Nathaniel tried to stand up to meet him, but his wounded shoulder made him move too slow. Grimwald's gun was almost pointing at Nathaniel's chest when something unexpected happened. A rock the size of a chicken egg flew through the air and struck Grimwald right between the shoulder blades. He stumbled forward, his shot going wild, and hitting the water trough instead of Nathaniel. Cordelia looked around wildly, trying to see who had thrown the rock. Then she saw him, a small figure crouched behind the woodpile. It was Tommy Brewster, the 10-year-old son of the store owner. He had been coming to visit Cordelia every few days, bringing her penny candy and news from town. "Run, Tommy!" Cordelia shouted. But the boy was already scrambling away into the gathering darkness. The distraction gave Nathaniel the time he needed. He rolled to his left and came up firing, his bullet catching Grimwald in the leg and dropping him to one knee. The remaining mounted man decided he had seen enough fighting for one night and spurred his horse toward the horizon, leaving his companions behind. Grimwald knelt in the dirt, bleeding from his hand and his leg, his face pale with shock and pain. His gun lay several feet away, where he had dropped it when Nathaniel's bullet hit him. "It's over, Silas," Ezekiel said, stepping down from the porch with his rifle still ready. "Time for you to collect your boys and ride out. This ain't over." Grimwald snarled through gritted teeth. "That girl is still worthless, and everybody in 3 counties knows it. You can't change what she is just by pretending different." Nathaniel walked slowly toward him, his left arm hanging limp but his gun hand steady. Blood had soaked through his shirt and was dripping onto the ground, but his voice was calm and sure. "You know what I learned when my Eleanor was dying?" Nathaniel said. "I learned that a person's worth ain't measured by what they can or can't do. It's measured by how much love they bring into the world, and how much love other people are willing to fight for to keep them in it." He gestured toward the cabin, where Cordelia watched from the window, tears streaming down her face. "That girl in there has more worth in her little finger than you've got in your whole twisted soul. And if you ever come back here threatening her again, I'll make sure you don't ride away next time." Grimwald struggled to his feet, helped by the one companion who hadn't been shot or scared off. They limped toward their horses, Grimwald's curses mixing with the sound of their spurs and the creak of leather saddles. "This ain't finished," he called back as they mounted up. "Mark my words, Blackwood. This ain't finished by a long shot." But as they rode away into the darkness, Cordelia knew something important had changed forever. Someone had finally stood up to the cruel words that had haunted her for so long. Someone had declared her worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth risking everything to protect. Through the window, she watched Nathaniel sink down onto the porch steps, Ezekiel already tearing strips from his own shirt to bandage the wounded shoulder. And for the first time since the fever had taken her legs, Cordelia Ashworth felt like she might actually have a future worth living. The sound of breaking glass shattered the morning quiet as Cordelia hurled her medicine bottle against the cabin wall. 3 days had passed since the gunfight, and the weight of what had happened pressed down on her chest like a boulder she couldn't move. Nathaniel sat in the corner, his wounded shoulder wrapped in clean bandages, watching her with patient eyes that made her want to scream. "You should have let them take me," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry wood in a fire. "Look what your kindness has cost you. Look what it's cost Papa." Ezekiel stood in the doorway, his face gray with exhaustion. He hadn't slept since Grimwald's visit, spending his nights pacing the porch with his rifle, jumping at every shadow that moved across the desert. The man who once carried himself with quiet pride now moved like someone carrying invisible chains. "Delia, that ain't true," he said, but his words sounded hollow, like echoes in an empty mine shaft. "Isn't it?" She turned her wheelchair to face him, her hands gripping the wooden armrests until her knuckles turned white. "Grimwald will be back. Men like him don't just ride away and forget. They come back with more guns, more anger, more reasons to hurt people." Nathaniel stood slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. He walked to the window and gazed out at the endless stretch of sagebrush and sand. In the distance, dust devils danced across the desert floor like tiny tornadoes, picking up everything in their path and scattering it to the wind. "My Eleanor used to say something when times got hard," he said without turning around. "She'd say that fear is like a hungry animal. The more you feed it, the bigger it grows. But courage is different. It doesn't need feeding. It just needs someone brave enough to let it out of its cage." Cordelia felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she pushed them back. Tears were for people who had the luxury of feeling sorry for themselves. She was not one of those people. Not anymore. "Your Eleanor is dead," she said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. "Just like I should be. Just like I will be if Grimwald comes back." The silence that followed felt thick as molasses. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to speak the truth that hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Ezekiel cleared his throat, the sound rough and painful. I was wrong. The words came out barely above a whisper, but they might as well have been shouted from the mountaintops for how they echoed in the small cabin. I was so wrong, Delia. About everything. He walked toward her wheelchair, his boots creaking against the wooden floor with each step. When he reached her, he dropped to his knees, like a man asking for forgiveness from something greater than himself. When your mama died giving birth to you, I thought the Lord was punishing me for something I'd done wrong. When the fever took your legs, I thought it was more punishment. I started seeing you as a burden instead of a blessing. I started listening to people like Grimwald instead of listening to my own heart. Cordelia stared at her father's bowed head, seeing the silver threads that had appeared in his hair over the past months. She had never noticed how old he looked, how the years of mining and worry had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. Papa. But, no. Let me finish. He raised his head, and she saw tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. You've been taking care of this house better than I ever did. You've been reading the mining reports, keeping track of our supplies, mending clothes and cooking meals from that bed like it was nothing. You've been living while I was busy planning your funeral. Nathaniel turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. Cordelia, show him the ledger you've been keeping. She hesitated, then wheeled herself to the small table where she kept her papers. The ledger was nothing fancy, just a composition book she had found in a trunk of her mother's things. But inside, she had carefully recorded every transaction, every expense, every small profit from the vegetables she had started growing in pots by her window. Ezekiel took the book with trembling hands, his eyes moving across the neat columns of numbers. His mouth fell open as he realized what he was looking at. This shows we got enough saved for winter supplies and then some, he said, his voice filled with wonder. How did you? I've been watching and learning, Cordelia said simply. Watching how much we spend on things we don't need. Learning which merchants give fair prices and which ones try to cheat us. Planning ahead instead of just hoping things work out. Nathaniel smiled for the first time since the shooting. She's been teaching herself bookkeeping from an old manual I found in my saddlebags. Turns out, she has a head for numbers that would put most bank clerks to shame. And the garden, Ezekiel said, looking through the window at the neat rows of vegetables growing in wooden boxes. You planned all that? Nathaniel built the boxes, but I chose what to plant and when. I've been reading Mama's old almanac, learning about soil and seasons, and which plants grow best together. Cordelia felt a flush of pride warm her cheeks. The tomatoes should be ready next week. And the herbs. Mrs. Patterson from the next claim over says she'll pay good money for dried sage and lavender. For the first time in months, Ezekiel smiled. It started as just a small upturn of his lips, but it grew until it transformed his entire face. He looked like the father she remembered from before her illness. The man who used to tell her stories about the places he would take her when she was old enough to travel. I've been such a fool, he said, shaking his head. Such a blind, stubborn fool. We all been fools about some things, Nathaniel said gently. The question is what we do about it now. Cordelia looked between the two men, feeling something shift inside her chest, like a key turning in a lock. For so long, she had seen herself through other people's eyes, as a burden, a problem to be solved, a life not worth living. But sitting here with her carefully kept ledger in her father's hands and her thriving garden visible through the window, she began to see something different. She began to see herself. The wedding dress hung from a peg on the cabin wall like a white flag of surrender. But Cordelia knew better. It was a declaration of war against everyone who had ever said she wasn't worth loving. The pale blue fabric, the only nice material available at the general store, caught the morning light streaming through the window, making it shimmer like water in a desert spring. You sure about this? Ezekiel asked for the 10th time that morning, his hands fumbling with the buttons on his best shirt. It ain't too late to change your mind. Cordelia laughed, a sound that had become more frequent over the past 3 months. Papa, I've been sure about this since the day Nathaniel stood up to Grimwald's men. The only thing I've been unsure about is whether I deserve someone who thinks I'm worth fighting for. Through the window, she could see neighbors arriving for the ceremony. The Hendersons, from the next claim over, carrying a basket of wildflowers. Old Pete, from the assay office, cleaned up and wearing what looked like a borrowed suit jacket. Even Mrs. Chen, from the Chinese camp, had come, bringing silk ribbon that she braided into Cordelia's dark hair with gentle fingers. The settlement of Silver Ridge had changed over the past year, and Cordelia realized she had played a part in that change. What started as her small vegetable garden had grown into something bigger. She now supplied herbs to 3 different towns, her remedies sought after by people who traveled days just to consult with the woman who knows healing. "Nathaniel's lucky to have you," said Mrs. Henderson, adjusting the simple bouquet of desert roses in Cordelia's lap. "My husband says you got the best business sense in the territory. Says you could run a bank if you set your mind to it." The compliment should have made her feel proud, but instead it made her think about all the time she had wasted believing she was worthless. How many months had she spent staring at the ceiling, waiting to die, when she could have been learning and growing and discovering what she was capable of? "I got something for you," Ezekiel said quietly, pulling a small wooden box from behind his back. "Was your mama's. Figured you should have it for your wedding day." Inside the box, nestled in faded velvet, was a silver locket. Cordelia had seen her mother wear it in the daguerreotype that sat on the mantel, but she had never seen it up close. The metal was tarnished with age, but the delicate engraving of roses still showed clearly. "She wanted you to have it when you got married," Ezekiel said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have given it to you long ago, but I stopped believing you'd ever have a wedding day." Cordelia opened the locket with trembling fingers. Inside was a tiny photograph of her parents on their wedding day, looking impossibly young and happy. On the other side, in her mother's careful handwriting, were the words, "For my daughter who will bloom wherever she's planted." The tears came then, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of finally understanding that her mother had seen something in her future that she hadn't been able to see in herself. "Help me put it on," she whispered. As Ezekiel fastened the chain around her neck, Cordelia caught sight of herself in the small mirror on the wall. The woman looking back at her was not the broken, hopeless person she had been a year ago. This woman had clear eyes and strong hands, and a future that stretched ahead of her like an open road. The sound of horses approaching made them all look toward the window. Cordelia's heart skipped when she saw Nathaniel riding up the path, dressed in his black suit and looking nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Behind him rode Preacher Morrison, a kind man who had agreed to perform the ceremony despite the unusual circumstances. "He's here, Mrs. Knott," Henderson announced unnecessarily, fluttering around the cabin like an excited butterfly. "Oh, this is so romantic. A Christmas wedding in the desert. Who would have thought?" Christmas had seemed like the perfect time for a new beginning. The air was crisp and clean, the sky a brilliant blue that made everything look fresh and possible. Even the sagebrush seemed to sparkle with frost, turning the familiar landscape into something magical. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands and his face lit up with a smile that made Cordelia's heart do somersaults in her chest. Over the past months, she had watched him transform too. The grief-stricken widower who had arrived at their door had become a man who laughed easily and dreamed of the future instead of mourning the past. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and Cordelia knew he meant it, not because she looked like other brides, but because she looked like herself, strong and determined and ready for whatever came next. The ceremony itself was simple but perfect. They spoke their vows on the porch, with the endless Nevada sky as their cathedral and the desert wind as their wedding music. When Preacher Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the small crowd cheered, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as if celebrating with them. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Cordelia sat in her wheelchair beside her new husband, watching their friends and neighbors share food and stories around a crackling fire. The trading post they had built together was already showing a profit, and there were plans for expansion in the spring. "No regrets?" Nathaniel asked quietly, taking her hand in his. Cordelia looked out at the vast expanse of desert that had once seemed like a prison, but now felt like home. In the distance, the lights of other settlements twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing other dreamers who had chosen to stay and build something in this harsh but beautiful land. "Only one," she said, squeezing his fingers. "I regret all the time I wasted believing I wasn't worth saving." The hawk circled overhead one more time before disappearing into the darkening sky, and Cordelia knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, surrounded by people who had chosen to see her worth when she couldn't see it herself, she finally understood what her mother's locket had been trying to tell her all along. She had bloomed exactly where she was planted, and the desert had never looked more beautiful.